The wind came early that night. It did not knock. It cut. Across the highline plain, doors rattled, stovepipes hummed, and men pushed extra wood against their walls. Windows were taped. Kettles were filled. Prayers were short. One cabin stood dark. Harlan Hal Mercer, a quiet ranch hand in Dry Creek Junction, was not inside it. He was in his barn. The boards were old. The nails were crooked. Between them leaked a thin yellow light, steady, almost calm. From the dirt road, travelers could see nothing else. The barn did not shake. It waited. The wind rose. Snow moved sideways. Cold searched for every crack. Families fed fires and watched their breath. Hal Mercer did not hurry. A door opened, then closed. The light held. The land was about to ask a question no man could argue with. Some stories from the frontier are not loud. They don't ask for attention. They simply endure like wood, like wire, like men who choose to stay. If you find meaning in these quiet histories of grit and weather, you're welcome to stay with us. Consider subscribing and leaving a like. It helps keep these histories alive and allows more of them to be told. Let us know where you're watching from. The frontier was wide, and so is this community. Inside the barn, the small light remained, and the storm drew nearer, as if the night itself wanted to see why he was there. And it would. The night did not belong to a single farm. It belonged to the country itself. Dry Creek Junction was not a town in the way maps imagine towns. It was a scatter of houses, a grain elevator, a gas pump, and a road that crossed the plains because there was nowhere else for it to go. Beyond the last fence post, the land ran flat for miles. No hills, no timber belts, nothing to slow the air. Here the wind did not arrive. It traveled. In February of 1969, the cold did not build slowly. It dropped. Mornings began below zero and never climbed far above it. Metal rang when struck. Water pumps groaned. Chickens stayed silent in their coops. Hal Mercer's place stood a little apart from the others. His barn was older than his cabin. Gray boards weathered nearly smooth. The roof set low against the horizon. The frame timbers inside were thick and stubborn, cut from heavier trees than the valley grew now. The structure looked tired but not weak. Still, people noticed the light. In such a place, comfort was never a guarantee. Only survival was. And Hal Mercer, staying in a barn instead of his house, looked to many like a man ignoring rules the land had already written. Hal Mercer was 41 years old, and known more by his habits than by his words. He worked wherever hands were needed, mending fence for one ranch, hauling feed for another, repairing bulky engines after supper when everyone else had gone home. If a tractor refused to start at dawn, someone would eventually say, "Ask Hal," and by morning it usually ran. He did not talk much while he worked. He did not complain either. Nothing about him suggested a man eager for attention, which was why people noticed when he stopped sleeping in his cabin. The change was simple. A week passed, then another. Lantern light appeared in the barn each night while the cabin stayed dark. Soon the small cafe near the highway had a new topic. Wade Kellen, a broad-shouldered cattle buyer who filled silence with laughter, shook his head over his coffee. "He's hiding from winter," he said, not unkindly. The others smiled because the joke eased something they did not name. Around here, endurance meant pride. Warmth was earned by suffering. At the end of the counter sat Caleb Stroud, an older carpenter who had framed most of the buildings in the junction. He did not laugh. He stirred his cup and looked through the window toward the empty plain. "Cold isn't a thing a man outsmarts," Caleb said quietly. "Cold waits." Hal Mercer never argued with any of them. When spoken to, he nodded once and returned to his work. He offered no explanation, as if the matter required none. The wind outside kept moving, and the town, without quite deciding to, waited for it to settle the question for him. But while the town saw only a fool abandoning comfort, Hal Mercer alone understood that the comfort itself had long since fractured within those seemingly solid walls. Hal's cabin had not been built carelessly. The logs were thick and straight, set tight with proper chinking. A stone hearth rose solid against the inner wall, laid with the patience of a man who intended to live there many winters. By every visible measure, It was the kind of house settlers trusted. The first winter passed with only small discomforts. The second introduced longer nights beside the fire. By the third, Hal noticed patterns. The north wind did not simply touch the house. It struck it. Long miles of empty ground gave the air room to gather speed, and when it met the cabin, it pressed against the logs like a hammer testing a nail. Hairline cracks appeared in the chinking. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that looked like failure. But at night, when the fire settled low and the room quieted, a thin current crept across the floorboards. It stayed close to the ground, sliding around boots and chair legs. It felt less like air and more like water. Hal would sit near the hearth, the coals glowing red, yet his ankles stayed cold. One corner of the room remained dim and stubbornly chilled no matter how bright the flames burned. He fed the fire again. The fire answered. The room did not. He was strong enough to cut more wood. He had done it for years, but the effort never changed the outcome. The problem was not the heat he produced. It was the heat he could not keep. The wind did not need to break the house. It only needed a path, and every night it found one. So Hal cut more wood. Each autumn he stacked higher than the year before. He split and hauled until the pile reached above the shed roof. By winter's end he had burned nearly 11 cords, a season measured not in months but in axe strokes. Yet he still woke to frost along the inside edge of the window glass. The wood itself betrayed him. Freezing rain coated the stacked logs with a thin glaze. Snow drifted against the pile and thawed under brief sun before freezing again. When he carried an armload inside, the pieces looked sound, but the moment they met flame, they hissed. Smoke came first, damp, sour, slow to rise. The fire had to spend itself drying the wood before it could warm the room. Heat was being spent on water instead of air. He fed the stove again, and still the corners held their cold. Fuel oil might have helped, but deliveries came irregularly. Roads closed without warning. Trucks turned back miles from the junction. A man could not rely on supply when weather decided the road did not exist. Hal worked harder and received the same result. Standing beside the stove one evening, he watched a log struggle to catch and understood something simple. The fire was doing its job. The house was not. One night the wind shifted. Instead of striking the cabin broadside, it found a low angle and pressed directly along the doorframe. The latch trembled. A thin line of air slipped under the threshold and spread across the floor. Hal sat near the stove. The fire burned clean and steady. The iron sides glowed faintly, yet the cold still reached his boots. He did not add wood. He watched. The flames bent slightly toward the stovepipe, then steadied again. The room was quiet, except for the draft, a faint whisper tracing the walls. Hal rose and walked the perimeter of the cabin. He placed his hand against each log seam, pausing wherever he felt movement. There was no single opening large enough to see, only many small ones, each stealing a little warmth. He said nothing. He simply stood there, feeling the current pass across his fingers. The stove was not failing. The fuel was not failing. The heat was leaving faster than it could gather. He looked back toward the room and understood. He was trying to warm a container that would not hold air. A larger fire would not solve it. More wood would not solve it. The space itself was the problem. Too much volume. Too many paths for moving air. To keep warmth, the space had to be smaller. And it had to be still. Morning came without warmth. The wind had not solved anything for him, but it had clarified the question. 2 days later, Hal heard that a highway maintenance crew was dismantling an old storage shed several miles east along the state road. The structure had been used for road salt and spare culvert pipe. Now the department was replacing it with a larger building closer to town. What remained was scrap. Hal left before daylight. The site sat beside a gravel turnout. The men there were already unbolting curved steel sections, stacking them beside a truck. Each piece was a shallow arch of corrugated metal, punched with bolt holes along its edges. To most eyes, they were awkward, half-ruined parts of a shed no one needed. Hal did not look at them as scrap. He examined the curvature, the way the edges overlapped, the spacing of the bolt pattern. He ran a gloved hand along the ribs, and then stepped back to judge their span. One of the crewmen, A road mechanic supervising the teardown asked if he planned to haul them for fencing or roofing. Hal shook his head once. He asked what they wanted for the lot. The price was small, $45, and the promise that a borrowed chain hoist needed to lift the last beam would come back with a new cable. Hal agreed immediately. There was no long bargaining, no hesitation. He loaded the arches carefully, separating them with planks so the metal would not bend. By mid-morning, his truck headed back across the open plain, the curved pieces rising above the bed like ribs. Neighbors expected him to stack them beside his cabin or sell them later. He did neither. He drove straight past the house. The truck stopped at the barn. One by one, the steel sections were carried inside. The barn doors closed behind them. From the outside, nothing changed. Yet inside, Hal began laying the pieces on the dirt floor, aligning their ends as if assembling a machine rather than a shelter. He worked without explaining himself. The wind kept moving across the fields, but for the first time the work he did was not against it. It was preparation. Something in his movements suggested he had already seen the finished shape long before the first bolt was set. Work began in the center bay of the barn. Hal cleared out broken boards, an old harness rack, and a rusted feeder no animal had used in years. He leveled the packed earth floor with a shovel and a straight plank, checking it not by guess but by eye and habit, the way a mechanic checks alignment. When the surface lay flat, he set a simple rectangular frame on top of it, 10 feet wide and 18 feet long. The curved steel sections followed. One by one he raised them, bolting each arch to the next, until a low tunnel stood beneath the barn rafters. The shape was not tall enough to waste heat overhead, and not narrow enough to feel cramped. It was deliberate. He filled the framed floor with planer shavings gathered from a nearby mill, tamping them down tightly. Over that he spread a thin layer of dry sand and laid rough boards across it. The boards did not creak. The ground beneath would not steal warmth easily. A heavy wooden door went into one end. Around its edges he fitted strips of salvaged rubber, pressing them tight so the door met the frame without a gap. No draft would slip past unnoticed. Inside, he set a small barrel stove and ran a 5-inch stovepipe upward through the barn roof. Where the pipe met the opening, he formed a metal collar and sealed it carefully, packing and smoothing the joint until no line of light showed through. He worked that seam longer than any other part, treating it less like carpentry and more like repairing a pressure leak. The barn itself did not warm. That was not its purpose. It stood around the steel shell as a shield, a broad wall against moving air. Wind might strike the outer boards, but it would slow before reaching the tunnel within. For the first time, Hal was not trying to strengthen the house. He was controlling the space inside it, and the structure waiting in the barn no longer resembled scrap. It resembled a system. It did not stay unnoticed for long. One afternoon, Wade Kellen arrived first, bringing 2 others under the excuse of returning a borrowed wrench. The barn doors were open, and the steel tunnel stood clear in the filtered light. Wade stopped in the entrance and laughed. Not harshly, but loudly enough to carry. "So that's it," he said. "Hal's keeping Winter penned up like livestock." The others smiled because the sight was strange. A man who owned a serviceable cabin had built a smaller shelter inside a larger one. To them, it looked backward. Hal kept working. He tightened a bolt along one rib, checked the seam with his hand, and moved to the next. Later, Caleb Stroud stepped inside. The older carpenter removed his gloves and tapped the metal curve with his knuckles. The sound rang sharp and cold. "Steel pulls heat away," he said calmly. "You'll sleep in a freezer." Hal paused only long enough to glance at the seam he had just finished. He nodded once and returned to his wrench. No defense, no explanation. The visitors took his silence as proof he could not answer. By evening, the story reached the cafe, then the feed store, then the gas pump. No one spoke with cruelty, but the meaning was clear. A man who left a good house for a metal tunnel was not trusting strength. He was avoiding hardship, and on the High Line, avoiding hardship was easily mistaken for weakness. The first night he lit the stove inside the steel shell, Hal did not lie down. He sat on a plain wooden chair and watched the fire. The flames moved differently here. They did not wander across the room the way they had in the cabin. They leaned slightly, then steadied as the stovepipe began to draw. A soft pull formed in the air, almost a current you could hear if you listened carefully enough. Hal listened. The sound inside the pipe was not loud, just a steady pull, a controlled breathing. When the draft held, the flame brightened and sharpened at the edges. When the wind outside shifted, the tone inside the pipe changed by a fraction. He adjusted the damper only a little. The fire answered immediately. Long before Dry Creek Junction knew him as a ranch hand, Hal Mercer had worked in a railroad spur yard as a boilermaker's fitter, tending the fireboxes of steam locomotives. His job had not been to shovel coal. It had been to make engines efficient. A locomotive could burn a mountain of fuel and still lose power if a seam leaked or a draft ran wrong. He learned to read heat the way others read weather. A small gap in a firebox door could waste more coal than a long day's run. A poor seal meant lost pressure. Lost pressure meant lost motion. The work demanded attention to things most men never saw: moving air, hidden paths, the difference between heat produced and heat kept. Now he looked at the cabin with the same understanding. It was not a weak house. It was a strong box that could not hold its fire. The wind outside the barn became not an enemy but a test. And inside the curved steel, Hal watched the flame and already knew the answer would not come from burning more. It would come from losing less. The cold deepened before midnight. Inside the curved steel, the warmth held, but a new problem appeared. A thin sheen formed along the inside of the metal arch. At first it looked like a faint fog. Then, droplets gathered and ran slowly downward, darkening the boards beneath. Condensation. Hal noticed it without surprise. Warm air met cold steel and gave up its moisture. The structure was tight enough to hold heat, and now it was tight enough to hold vapor as well. He stood and studied the stovepipe. The sound had changed. Outside, the wind had shifted across the barn wall, and the draft weakened. The flame inside the stove softened and rolled instead of rising. Smoke lingered a moment longer than it should before being pulled away. A lesser man might have fed more wood. Hal did the opposite. He opened a narrow vent near the end panel, only a finger's width, letting a measured line of fresh air enter. He rotated a log inside the stove so its edge caught the hotter coals and adjusted the damper a fraction at a time. The pull returned slowly, the pipe breathing again. Where droplets collected along the arch, he hung a strip of dry cloth to interrupt the run and keep water from reaching the floor. Within minutes, the flame sharpened and the smoke cleared. The shelter had not failed. It had spoken. Hal listened, corrected, and the system steadied. The warning came over the radio in the feed store first, then passed from truck to truck along the road. An Arctic front was moving down from Saskatchewan, fast, heavy, the kind that did not pass in a day. By afternoon, the sky hardened to a pale, metallic gray. The wind rose before the temperature fell, pushing fine snow ahead of the storm. It did not drift downward. It drove sideways across the plain, rattling wire fences and filling wagon ruts within minutes. Night approached early. Doors were barred, windows taped. Men hurried livestock into sheds and barns. Fires were built larger than usual. More wood, faster burning, the old response. Then the temperature dropped. It did not ease into cold. It plunged. Metal squealed as it contracted. Water buckets froze solid before dawn. The road into Dry Creek Junction disappeared beneath blown snow, and no engine sound came from the highway afterward. The wind climbed above 60 miles an hour. It struck walls and circled corners, searching every seam. Chimneys groaned. Loose boards snapped. Snow forced itself under eaves and through nail holes no one had noticed in summer. Inside his barn, Hal Mercer shut the wooden door of the steel shelter. He placed a single piece of dry pine into the stove. The wood caught immediately. No hiss, no smoke clouding the air. Flame rose clean and steady, drawn upward by the pipe's pull. He closed the damper slightly and watched the burn settle into a controlled glow. Outside, the barn absorbed the first blows of the storm. The outer boards shuddered, but the air inside them slowed. The curved shell within felt no moving wind, only stillness. Across the junction, families fed their fires again and again as the night deepened. Flames roared, yet rooms chilled between feedings. Every gust demanded more fuel. Hal did not add another log. The stove worked quietly, and the small space warmed evenly, as if the cold had been left outside with the weather. The storm had arrived, and at last the land had begun its judgment. By the second morning, the cold settled into numbers the valley rarely spoke aloud. The thermometer outside the feed store stopped at 44 below. Wind drove across it hard enough that no one needed to ask what it felt like. Diesel engines refused to turn. Fuel thickened inside tanks. Even metal tools left on porches snapped their handles when lifted. Houses began to fail in small ways first. Chimneys cracked where heat met ice. One stovepipe pulled loose from a roof collar and filled a kitchen with smoke before daylight. Families woke every few hours to feed their fires, not to warm the house, but to keep it from surrendering. Flames roared, died back, and had to be raised again before the walls cooled completely. Sleep came in pieces. Across the junction, lanterns burned at all hours as men rose repeatedly to carry in more wood. The piles shrank quickly. Each armload had to fight moisture before it gave heat, and every pause allowed the cold to return. Inside Hal Mercer's barn, frost coated the inner boards like white paint. The air there was bitter and unmoving, but inside the curved steel shelter, the temperature held steady. The small stove radiated heat evenly across the arch. The metal warmed and returned that warmth to the air instead of letting it escape. No wind crossed the floor. No cold current reached the bed. Hal slept. He did not wake to feed the fire. He did not dress in layers before rising. When he opened his eyes near morning, his breath did not sting his lungs. He removed his gloves and set them beside the stove to dry, something no one else in the junction could have done that day. Outside, the storm tightened its grip. Inside, still air held its ground. A mile south of Hal's place, Dale Rigsby fought the storm the proper way. Dale was not careless. His frame house was sound, built square and insulated as well as materials allowed. A second stove stood ready in the back room for emergencies. In ordinary winters, his preparations were enough, but the road had closed before the fuel truck arrived. By the second day, the oil tank ran dry. Dale turned to wood, just as generations had done before him. The pile stood where he had stacked it in autumn, but overnight the storm buried half of it beneath hard-packed drifts. Each trip outside meant digging with a shovel, while the wind burned his face raw. The logs he uncovered were soaked from ground moisture and freezing melt. When he carried them in and set them to the fire, they smoked before they burned. Thick gray air filled the room while the flames struggled to take hold. He wore his coat indoors. At night, he lay awake, listening for the fire to weaken, rising every few hours to feed it again. Sleep came in fragments. Fingers stiffened. Boots never fully dried. The house was not failing from neglect. It was losing a contest it had been designed to endure, not defeat. Air slipped through unseen paths in the walls. Each draft carried warmth away faster than the stove could replace it. Moisture stole heat before the room could keep it. Dale worked constantly, and still the temperature inside dropped. Outside, the wind showed no concern for effort or pride. It pressed at every seam without pause. The lesson grew plain and frightening. Strength alone did not matter. The cold did not care how hard a man tried. While others fought the storm with motion, Hal answered it with routine. Inside the steel shelter, a small notebook rested on a crate beside the bed. The entries were brief. A time, a mark for the amount of wood added, a note about how the draft sounded in the pipe. Nothing written for anyone else to read, only enough to understand what the fire was doing. Near midnight he rose, opened the inner door, and stepped into the barn. The cold there struck hard and immediate. Frost clung to the rafters, and the walls glittered faintly in the lantern light. The wind hit the outer boards in steady blows, strong enough to shake dust from the beams. He stayed only a few seconds, checking the roof line and the stovepipe collar from below. Then he returned inside and closed the door carefully behind him. The difference was immediate. Within the curved steel walls, the air held still, warm without roaring heat. The stove did not rage. It worked. Hal adjusted the damper slightly, no more than the width of a coin, and the flame sharpened. The pipe's tone steadied. He sat again and wrote a single line in the notebook. Outside, the storm continued to pound at the barn as though trying to reach him. Inside, the shelter behaved less like a room and more like a controlled chamber, a firebox scaled to human size. Hal did not boast and did not hurry. He observed, corrected, and waited. The weather pressed harder. The system held. Late on the third day, the wind slackened for the first time. It did not stop. It simply paused, as if drawing breath. The sky opened into a hard blue, and the air grew clearer, though no warmer. Dale Rigsby used the moment. He started his truck, coaxed the stiff engine to life, and drove slowly across the drifted road toward Hal Mercer's place. He expected to find trouble. A man could not leave a house in weather like this and come through unchanged. Instead, he saw Hal outside the barn, sleeves rolled, splitting a short stack of kindling beside the door. The motion was ordinary, unhurried. No frost clung to his beard. No heavy coat hung from his shoulders. Dale stopped the truck and stepped down into the snow. The air burned his lungs, yet the barn door stood open a hand's width without the wind forcing it wide. He walked inside. The barn air was cold but calm. No gust struck his face. Snow did not swirl through the doorway. In the center stood the curved steel shelter. Its small wooden door closed. Hal opened it. Warmth moved outward in a slow wave. Not a blast of heat, but a steady, even air that felt alive compared to the cold outside. Dale stepped across the threshold and stopped. The temperature difference needed no measurement. His hands loosened. His breath settled. Hal said nothing. He handed over the small notebook. Dale read the entries. Times, short marks, fuel amounts far smaller than his own. He did not argue. He did not question. He understood. The storm had not defeated Hal's shelter. It had exposed his own effort for what it was, energy spent into moving air. He closed the notebook and gave it back without a word. By afternoon, the road held enough for others to travel it. The story moved faster than the wind ever had. Men arrived in pairs, then small groups, boots crunching over the frozen yard. They entered the barn carefully, not with the laughter they had carried days earlier, but with the cautious steps used around something unfamiliar. They felt the calm air first. A few spoke quietly. Others only looked. Caleb Stroud came last. The older carpenter stepped through the doorway with his hands folded across his coat. His face unchanged, but his pace slower than before. He paused near the steel arch and studied it without comment. He tapped the metal once with his knuckle. The sound rang clear. He looked at the seam where moisture had once gathered and now lay dry. His gaze followed the stovepipe upward to the collar, sealed tight against the roof, every edge smoothed and packed. Then he opened the inner door and stepped inside. He remained there a long moment. No words, no movement, only observation. The air was warm and still, the stove working quietly at its center. When he came back out, he faced Hal. "You sealed it right," he said. Nothing more. No apology followed. None was needed. Around them, the men who had once joked did not speak at all. The laughter that had filled the cafe days earlier did not return. The weather had answered for Hal, and the town accepted the reply. After that day, the questions changed. Men no longer asked Hal why he had done it. They asked how. Some only wanted reassurance. Others wanted measurements. Among them was Owen Pike, a dairy farmer who kept careful books and wasted little motion. He did not debate or defend tradition. He listened. He walked the length of the steel shelter, studying seams and corners the way a farmer studies soil. Hal answered in short sentences. He spoke of tight doors, dry fuel, and still air. Nothing more. Weeks later, in a corner of Owen's unused milk shed, a smaller structure appeared. It was not identical. The frame was wooden instead of steel, and the roof was covered with reclaimed sheet metal. But the space was reduced, the gaps were sealed, and the stovepipe rose clean through a collar packed tight. The next cold snap arrived without ceremony. It was not as severe as the great storm, yet strong enough to test a man's preparation. Owen did not wake through the night to feed his fire. His house remained steady in temperature. The fuel pile lasted longer than he expected. He drove to Hal's place the following morning. No speech passed between them. Owen stepped from his truck, removed his glove, and offered his hand. Hal took it once, firm and brief. No praise was spoken. None was required. The lesson had moved beyond a single barn. What worked for one man now worked for another. The winter remained unchanged, but the way men faced it had shifted. The story did not stop at the junction. Within weeks, it traveled beyond the cafe and the gas pump, carried by feed deliveries and repair calls. A report reached the county office, and one morning a government sedan appeared on the road to Hal's place. Marjorie Lane stepped out, a county farm and building safety advisor, whose work usually involved inspecting barns, checking wiring, and advising farmers on safer layouts. She carried a tape measure and a clipboard instead of opinions. She did not come to admire, she came to examine. Hal opened the barn and let her pass without introduction. She paced the length of the structure, measuring the clearance between the outer wall and the inner shell. She recorded the width and height of the curved steel, then traced the stovepipe from stove to roofline. At the collar she paused, noting the packed seal and the absence of frost marks. Inside the shelter she checked the small vent opening and the placement of the stove. She observed the cloth strip where moisture had once gathered and saw the boards beneath remain dry. Hal answered only when asked, pointing rather than explaining. No salesmanship, no claim of invention. Marjorie sketched the layout carefully in her notebook, adding measurements beside each line. She closed the clipboard and looked once more around the interior. This should be written up, she said. Others could use it. The remark carried more weight than praise. It meant the idea had moved beyond rumor. It had entered record. By evening, the barn no longer held a curiosity. It held a method. Years passed. Seasons returned in their usual order, and storms came and went without becoming legend. The junction grew a little, lost a little, and changed the way small places always do, quietly and without ceremony. The barn remained. Its boards were older now, silvered by weather, but still standing against the open plain. Inside, the curved shelter remained as well, though not unchanged. Hal had added a short entry partition to hold warmth when the door opened. A small south-facing window admitted winter sunlight during clear mornings. Hooks near the arch held gloves and coats, where rising heat could dry them slowly. Nothing about the place looked dramatic. It looked used. One autumn afternoon, a woman arrived in a borrowed truck. Evelyn Hart, a regional magazine writer who collected accounts of practical living, had followed the story through county bulletins and word of mouth. She was not searching for folklore. She wanted explanation. Hal met her at the barn door and let her see everything. She took notes while he spoke sparingly. He showed her the door seal, the stovepipe collar, and the small vent opening. He described the need for dry wood and the importance of still air, never raising his voice and never calling it invention. At last, she asked a simple question. "If you were starting again," she said, "what would you change?" Hal considered before answering. He did not begin with the storm. He did not speak of the cold. "I'd leave out the part where folks had to call me foolish first," he said. Then he rested his hand lightly against the curved wall beside him. "But the part about making winter smaller," he added, "I'd do that the same." Evelyn wrote it down exactly. The lesson was plain enough without embellishment. Survival had not come from enduring more hardship. It had come from understanding limits. Efficiency was not weakness. Pride did not warm a room. The weather did not reward stubbornness or punish caution. It followed rules older than memory. Out on the plain, the wind still moved across the High Line each winter. It would return long after any one man was gone. But the method remained, passed quietly from hand to hand. And so the story ended not as a tale of a single storm, but as a simple truth. Nature could not be argued with, only understood. If a blizzard came tonight where you live, would you trust your house? Or would you build a smaller shelter inside it?